morning of 1943, fog hung low over the German testing grounds, curling around the jagged edges of concrete bunkers and the skeletal frames of abandoned tanks. Sergeant Kumersdorf wiped his gloved hands on his uniform and stepped forward, squinting at the silhouette of the Sherman that had been shipped from Tunisia. Its olive-green paint was scarred and chipped, tracks worn deep from thousands of miles, yet it sat there with an almost defiant calm, as if daring the Germans to question its worth. He had expected a sluggish, fragile machine, the kind that creaked under pressure and gave way to anything heavier, but this was different. He circled the tank, tapping the steel plating with a gloved knuckle, and listened to the dull echo that spoke of thickness, of resilience. The Germans had built Panthers and Tigers like art, sleek, precise, terrifying, but the Sherman felt practical. There was no flourish, no pretension. Its lines were simple, almost crude, yet every bolt, every seam, hinted at thoughtfulness, at a design meant to endure, to survive. Kumersdorf climbed into the driver's seat, feeling the rumble of the engine beneath him, a sound steady and uncomplaining. It runs flawlessly after 5,000 miles of combat, he muttered under his breath, a note of disbelief creeping into his tone. The crew pushed it forward over rough terrain, rocks crunching under tracks, mud slapping against the sides. Each movement seemed effortless, each turn measured and precise. For hours, they tested the suspension, the steering, the gun traverse, expecting flaws, breakdowns, failures, but none came. The Sherman moved as if it had a purpose of its own, unbothered by obstacles that had immobilized the mightiest German tanks. Kumersdorf's mind raced. All their calculations, their pride in engineering, their obsession with sheer power, it suddenly seemed like a different kind of game was being played. And yet, as the sun began to rise higher, glinting off the battered hull and reflecting in the dust kicked up by the tracks, a slow, uneasy thrill crept over the sergeant. Here was a machine that did not impress with sheer size, with terrifying guns, or with armor that could swallow shells whole. It impressed simply by showing up again and again, moving when others would break, enduring when others would fail. For all their Tigers and Panthers, the Allies had brought something entirely unexpected onto the battlefield. A smaller, simpler tank, quietly rewriting the rules of war. Kumersdorf took a deep breath, staring at the Sherman, knowing that the lesson it carried was only beginning to reveal itself. The roar of machinery echoed through the Detroit factories, a steady rhythm of purpose that seemed almost alive. On the assembly lines, hundreds of hands moved in concert, sliding steel plates into place, bolting engines with practiced precision, testing each component and sending the next tank down the line. Every Sherman that rolled out wasn't a work of art. It was a promise that enough of these machines would reach the front to matter, that the war could be fought in numbers, reliability, and speed. Across the ocean, the Germans were crafting masterpieces. Tigers and Panthers emerged like sculptures, each rivet and weld calculated to perfection, each machine a technological marvel. The armor was thick, the guns powerful, the lines sleek and purposeful, but behind the beauty lay a fragility. The smallest flaw could halt an entire campaign. Kumersdorf remembered the first time he saw a Panther in action, its sloped armor gleaming in the sunlight, engine growling like a predator. He had marveled at the engineering, at the thought that such precision could exist in a machine meant for destruction. And yet, watching the Sherman work, he felt a different kind of awe, a quiet, unassuming respect. Here was a tank that didn't demand admiration. It demanded trust. Its armor was lighter, the gun smaller, the silhouette higher and more exposed. By German standards, it should have been inferior. But the Sherman's brilliance lay not in perfection, but in pragmatism. It was standardized, parts were interchangeable, maintenance was simple, production was fast. The Americans didn't need a handful of invincible tanks. They needed thousands of tanks that could move, fight, and survive. Where German engineers obsessed over every detail, calculating every angle and armor thickness, the Americans focused on the bigger picture: operational effectiveness. Reliability mattered more than sophistication, adaptability more than elegance. On the battlefield, the difference was stark. A single Tiger could dominate a skirmish, but an entire platoon of Shermans could endure, maneuver, and outlast, rewriting the rules of engagement not with power, but with persistence. Split-screen images haunted Kummersdorf's memory. On the left, German engineers meticulously assembling a Tiger, each bolt torqued to exact specifications. On the right, the frenzied hum of American factories, workers moving with fluid precision, tanks marching off the line in relentless succession. It was a philosophical divide rendered in steel and fire. Perfection versus pragmatism, artistry versus endurance, one man's obsession versus an entire nation's industrial heartbeat. And as the war pressed on, it became clear that numbers, reliability, and relentless production were quietly shifting the balance of power in ways the Germans had never anticipated. Kummersdorf watched from the edge of the testing yard as the Sherman rumbled forward, tracks churning up dust and gravel with a steady, relentless rhythm. Every test was designed to expose weakness, to push this American tank to its breaking point, but time after time it simply endured. Static analysis showed the armor was lighter than a Panther or Tiger, the gun smaller, the silhouette taller, but none of that seemed to matter. What impressed him most was how effortlessly it absorbed punishment that would cripple a German vehicle. During mobility trials, the Sherman's suspension flexed over jagged terrain with surprising grace. Rocks, trenches, mud, each obstacle was met with mechanical composure, as if the tank understood instinctively how to keep moving. Kummersdorf's eyes narrowed when he noticed the gyroscopic gun stabilizer, a technology unfamiliar to the Germans. Even while bouncing over uneven ground, the Sherman's gun held its aim, firing accurately where others would falter. This was a tactical edge the engineers hadn't anticipated, a subtle advantage hidden beneath a seemingly ordinary exterior. The tank's engine purred under strain, transmission gears shifting smoothly, no stutters, no overheating. When something did break, it wasn't catastrophic. Standardized parts allowed field repairs that would take a Tiger crew hours, maybe days, to complete. A Sherman crew could have the tank ready to fight again within the same day. Each test brought a creeping realization. This wasn't just a tank. It was a machine that simply worked, relentlessly and dependably, without the fanfare of German precision or the intimidation of raw firepower. Kummersdorf's mind raced as he compared side by side the intricate mechanisms of the Panther and Tiger with the Sherman's straightforward engineering. The Germans had crafted masterpieces of technical brilliance, yet even minor damage could immobilize them. Here was a humble machine that didn't dazzle with complexity, but outlasted, outmaneuvered, and outperformed in ways that no blueprint had predicted. Slowly, the myth of American mediocrity began to crumble in his mind, replaced by an uneasy respect for this quiet, unassuming instrument of war. In the deafening roar of Detroit's factories, the war was being won before a single shot was fired. Conveyor belts clattered, presses hammered, and tens of thousands of hands moved in a near-perfect rhythm, assembling a machine that would redefine armored warfare. The Sherman tank. One after another, these tanks rolled off the production lines, ready to be shipped across oceans to battlefields half a world away. Each was designed not for brilliance or perfection, but for one simple principle: keep fighting, keep moving, and keep winning. Across the Atlantic, in German factories, the story was different. Here, a single Tiger tank emerged only after months of meticulous labor, each one a monumental feat of engineering, painstakingly crafted by experts and consuming resources that could have built dozens of Shermans. The contrast was staggering. America produced 49,000 Shermans. Germany could muster only 1,350 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers over the course of the war. Cost alone tells the story. A single Tiger could consume resources equivalent to a dozen Shermans. The Panther, still a sophisticated marvel, barely dented the tide of Allied steel. While the Germans obsessed over perfection, calculating every millimeter of armor and every degree of gun elevation, the Americans understood the power of scale. Industrial mobilization itself had become a weapon, and in this quiet war of factories, the Allies were undefeated. The factories tell the story. The Chrysler Detroit Arsenal, Fisher, Press Steel, Ford, and countless smaller plants became temples of mass production. Lines stretched for hundreds of meters, each station manned by workers performing specialized tasks. Parts were standardized, interchangeable, and designed to be assembled quickly. A damaged Sherman could be repaired in hours by a trained crew, a capability the German engineering giants could only dream of. The Sherman's strength was not in its armor or firepower, but in its reliability and availability. It was a tank that could keep moving even after months of harsh service, a machine that worked as designed, every time. Volume became strategy. The Germans could produce a technically superior tank, a marvel on paper, but they could not match the relentless output of American industry. In battle, this imbalance became decisive. Tigers and Panthers could dominate a local engagement, but they could not withstand the constant wave of Shermans rolling forward, repaired or replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Production numbers, repairability, and speed of deployment outweighed any single tank's technical advantages. By 1944, the lesson was clear. Germany's obsession with technical mastery had blinded it to the realities of war, while America's pragmatic approach, its ability to flood the battlefield with reliable, replaceable machines, created a decisive advantage. The Sherman may have lacked the awe-inspiring presence of a Tiger, but in the relentless calculus of total war, it was unstoppable. In the end, the factory floors of Detroit did what no battlefield tactic could. They turned quantity into quality, ensuring that America's industrial might became the backbone of Allied victory. The fog rolled in thick over the fields of Lorraine, swallowing the hedgerows and muting the sounds of engines and artillery. Inside a Sherman's steel hull, Corporal Harris wiped condensation from his periscope and leaned forward, listening to the steady hum of the engine beneath his boots. It wasn't fear that filled the crew. It was expectation. They had been moving since dawn, over broken roads and muddy ground, and the tank hadn't complained once. Somewhere ahead, German armor waited. Tigers, Panthers, monsters on paper. On the other side of the field, a German Tiger sat motionless at the edge of a tree-line. Its crew cursed quietly as they wrestled with a stubborn transmission, hands slick with oil and frustration. The tank was lethal, unstoppable in a straight fight, but it had arrived late. Mechanical failures had thinned their numbers long before they ever reached the battlefield. Of the 45 Tigers assigned to the sector, only a handful were operational. The rest were abandoned along roadsides, victims of their own complexity. The Shermans advanced through the mist, not charging, not hesitating, just moving. At Aracourt, speed and coordination mattered more than armor thickness. American crews used the fog like a weapon, closing distances where German long-range guns lost their advantage. A Sherman appeared suddenly at close range, fired, then vanished back into the haze. Another took its place. When one tank was hit, the crew bailed out, shaken but alive, already signaling for recovery vehicles. By nightfall, many of those damaged Shermans would be repaired and back in action. German crews felt it keenly, the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that never seemed to thin out. Destroy one Sherman, and two more appeared. Knock out a platoon, and replacements arrived the next morning. Panthers, for all their firepower, struggled with muddy terrain and overstressed engines. Tigers, once feared, became liabilities when fuel ran low or parts failed. The battlefield became littered with abandoned German armor, not always destroyed by enemy fire, but surrendered to exhaustion and mechanical defeat. Harris's Sherman took a hit that cracked a track guard and jammed a road wheel. The tank shuddered, lurched, then stopped. For a moment, silence. Then the engine cut, the hatch opened, and the crew spilled out into the mud. They expected the worst. Instead, recovery crews arrived before sunset. By dawn, the tank was running again. Same engine, same crew, same mission. This was the proof no blueprint could capture. Reliability wasn't glamorous. It didn't inspire awe or fear at first glance. But it won battles. While German tanks waited for spare parts that never came, Shermans kept rolling. While elite crews guarded rare machines, American crews trusted that if their tank failed, another would replace it. In the grinding reality of war, that confidence became decisive. The battles of Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes taught a brutal lesson. Power without endurance meant nothing. Perfection that could not be sustained collapsed under its own weight. And as the Shermans pressed forward, day after day, the myth of German armored supremacy dissolved. Not in a single dramatic clash, but in thousands of small, relentless advances that could not be stopped. By the final years of the war, the truth had become impossible to ignore. The battlefield was no longer decided by who built the most impressive tank, but by who built a system that could keep fighting when everything else broke down. Along muddy roads in France, across frozen fields in the Ardennes, and through the ruins of Germany itself, Shermans moved in endless columns. Some scarred, some patched with welded plates, some freshly painted, but all moving, all fighting, all replacing what had been lost the day before. German commanders understood this too late. They had poured genius, time, and resources into machines that dazzled engineers and terrified enemies, but they had neglected the invisible architecture of war. Logistics, maintenance, fuel, spare parts, and trained crews. A Tiger without fuel was just steel. A Panther without spare parts was just a bunker on tracks. A masterpiece without a system was doomed the moment it left the factory. American doctrine was different. If a Sherman broke, mechanics fixed it. If it burned, another arrived. If a crew was lost, replacements were trained by the thousands. The tank was not the weapon, the system was. Supply convoys stretched across continents, factories worked around the clock, and training camps turned civilians into crews with relentless speed. The Sherman was never meant to be immortal. It was meant to be replaceable. And in total war, replaceable was invincible. Veteran German officers would later admit the irony. They had designed tanks to win duels, while the Americans had designed an army to win wars. Mobility, logistics, and adaptability mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. The Sherman fit into a machine that could move, repair, adapt, and overwhelm. It was not the spear, it was the bloodstream. As the war ended, rows of abandoned Tigers and Panthers rusted in fields and forests, their engines silent, their promise undone by their own complexity. Meanwhile, Shermans continued to run, continued to be repaired, continued to serve in new conflicts long after victory in Europe. They were never the strongest. They were never the most feared on paper, but they were always there. In the end, the Sherman's legacy was not about steel or firepower. It was about philosophy, a belief that war is not won by perfection, but by persistence. That a machine that works, again and again, will outlast any masterpiece that fails once. And as history proved, the tank that kept showing up, the humble, reliable Sherman, didn't just fight the war. It helped win it.